very pleased to introduce Emily Marshall. Emily is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Franklin and Marshall. Oh. She received her PhD in Sociology from Princeton, where she was a trainee in the Office of Population Research, and then she completed a postdoc at the Population Studies Center at University of Michigan, where she did some work with Jennifer Barber and others. Her dissertation examined how institutional and cultural factors affect the social construction of the meaning of fertility rates in the post-war period in Europe, and she's now doing innovative work, we'll soon hear about, on how improved understanding of cognitive processes can inform our understanding of social and cultural influences on demographic behavior, specifically fertility. This work has been funded to date by NIH, and her prior work has appeared in Social Forces, PDR, among other venues. So please join me in welcoming Emily.
All for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for coming to sit in this warm room on a beautiful day. So I would also like to credit my co-author, Mana Shepard of Rutgers University. This is a joint project with her. And this is an ongoing project, so we welcome all of your feedback. So today I'm going to talk about cultural schemas and contraceptive use among young women. All right, so there are some substantive puzzles in our understanding of contraceptive use. Start with contraceptive use among young women in the US. This is all in the US context today. Is widespread but inconsistent. So 89% of women at risk of unintended pregnancy had used contraception in the past month in the 2008 NSFG. So women know about contraception and use it. At the same time, about 50% of unintended pregnancies happen during a month in which contraception was used. So these women who know about contraception and use it do not apparently always use it. And given failure rates of the methods they're using, we can tell that these are mainly due to non-use or inconsistent use, not to method failure. So there are a lot of things we still don't understand about contraception in this context. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how it's part of this larger issue in sociology that individuals often behave in ways that are not completely consistent with the attitudes that they report having. This is an issue that's been studied across many different domains. In the domain of fertility, we can think about how fertility intentions are a good predictor of realized fertility in the aggregate, but individual women often have more or fewer children than they say that they want, right? So some kind of inconsistency between people's stated attitudes or preferences and their behavior. So we are interested in whether using cognitive models and advances in cognitive science can help us understand demographic behavior. So can we improve understanding of demographic behavior by incorporating insights from the study of cognition? And this follows in the theoretical interventions by people including Jennifer Johnson-Hanks and colleagues. Bachrach and Morgan proposed a social cognitive model in a 2013 paper, and Chris Bachrach's presidential address also talks about how this might be a site for improving our understandings of behavior. So following in this direction, we are going to, in the project I'm presenting today, define cultural schemas and their relevance to demographic behavior. We're going to use relational methods to measure cultural schemas of childbearing in a population. We're going to identify subgroups with distinct cultural schemas, and we're going to use membership in these groups to predict contraceptive behavior. So that's our roadmap. Okay, so to start with, one of the key concepts in this discussion of using cognitive science to understand demographic behavior has been schemas. So Chris Bachrach in particular has talked a lot about schemas. So a schema is a form of mental representation. It's a cognitive structure in the brain that organizes cognitive associations. So in other words, those are the things that come to mind when we think about something. What else does it remind us of? Schemas play a key role in the processes of storing and retrieving information. And an important thing about schemas for this project is that they're relational. Schemas are part of what tells us which things are related to each other and how they're related. So for example, we can imagine each person in this room has a schema for motherhood, for example, which organizes what you think about when you think about motherhood and what concepts and associations we consider relevant to motherhood. Okay, so this is the concept of schema as a feature, a property of an individual that describes something that's in an individual's brain, right? We're going to be talking more today about cultural schemas, And the key feature of cultural schemas is that they are shared. So when we're talking about cultural schemas, these are shared networks of ideas. So they are formed through interaction. This is one thing that makes them cultural. As we go through life interacting with people and learning from media and other social influences, we develop ideas about what's associated with motherhood, for example. They also can become institutionalized, so there can be a dominant way of thinking about things that's reflected in widespread cultural schemas. And these involve both the content of what we think about when we think about motherhood and the structure. So how are these ideas associated with each other? And here I'm going to give an example from Bacharach 2014. And she gives an example of a traditional model of marriage that might be first half of the 20th century, sort of Churlin style traditional model of marriage. You see in the upper left, love and companionship are connected to mutual support. You see in the upper right, sex is connected to childbearing, right? Those ideas are strongly linked. And childbearing is also strongly connected to childbearing. And then you see in this cluster in the bottom, there's a concept that male breadwinners and female domesticity are connected concepts, right? And these are all united by the concept of security and commitment. And then she discusses how through various social changes that happened during the 60s and 70s, there began to be an alternative script for marriage. Part of that is this blue node of rights, equality, and fulfillment that connected the idea of mutual support away from an idea of pure female domesticity. So the fact that these two nodes in the bottom are lighter means that rather than there being a single model of female domesticity, there began to be two alternate models, right? There's still a model of female domesticity, but there's a coexisting model of women as earners, right? So cultural schemas are shared across people, but that doesn't mean they're universally shared, right? You can think about how within a population there might be subgroups of the population that have different associations with motherhood, right? For example, so all of our schemas, we each have a schema of motherhood, right? All of them probably have some things in common. They probably all involve a woman and a child in some way. But there might be other features, for example, how relevant paid work outside of the home is to schemas of motherhood would probably vary across places and over time, right? So that is culturally dependent. So this is the idea that we're using, that people's associations with a concept organized by schemas in content and structure are cultural schemas. Okay, so how would we go about measuring cultural schemas? One of the things that we want to do is figure out if these things exist, how do we know who has which kind of them, right? So relational analyses allow us to holistically consider multiple concepts and areas of life that are related to fertility. That's somewhat abstract. I'll talk about the specific kinds of relational analyses that we're doing. But the idea here is that any single attitude measure or conventional method for combining attitude measures inadequately reflects schemas. So if we're running a regression model and we throw in an attitude or a couple of attitudes, that's not really the best way to measure a schema, right? Because measuring a schema will involve both the associated ideas but also the structure of how they're associated. So that's really what we're going for. I should note that one of our goals here in this project is to try to do something that could be considered demographer friendly. So there's been a lot of really interesting work that looks at schemas. We're trying to do something with replicable methods that can be done with a representative sample of a population of interest. So that's one of the challenges. Okay, if we're thinking about cultural schemas of childbearing in particular, there are certain domains that we think are relevant that we're including in this study. So these are informed by the literature. These relevant domains include birth control, attitudes about motherhood itself, relationships and sex, including relationship sequencing, what kinds of relationships sex is appropriate in or not. Education and career is another area. General timing of childbearing in general, is it better to have kids earlier or later? And timing of childbearing for the self. So in your personal life, would it be better to have kids earlier or later? So these are the domains we're interested in. Make one adjustment. All right, so how are we going to go about measuring these things? So we want to find evidence of shared sets of associations in a population. Remember, because we define cultural schemas as the shared models. We are following on work by Paul DiMaggio and others that really highlights that the meaning of survey responses is clearer in relation to other survey responses. So we all know that people who give the same response to an individual survey item may be thinking about very different things while they're giving that response, right? And while we can't fully solve that problem, when we take their responses in combination with their responses to other questions, we are able to probably understand better what they meant by that one response. Another thing that we are doing that this picks up on is that a group that shares patterns between survey items indicates shared ways of thinking about those items, right? So that is an assumption of this project, is that when we find people have similar patterns between the way they answer survey items, this is how we can capture and measure shared ways of thinking about those items. Okay, so we are also arguing that cultural schemas can help us by describing population heterogeneity. We have a lot of ways of describing population heterogeneity, right? We can look at sociodemographic characteristics. That's something demographers do a lot of, right? But this is a different form of population heterogeneity. And as opposed to using attitudes in a regression, where we pop them in and then maybe we run predicted probabilities for people we're imagining, we can actually see in a population which people have which kind of models and how many of them there are. So we're going to use two methods that capture the relational nature of attitudes to do all these great things that we're hoping to do. And we're asking, can these help us understand population heterogeneity? So what kinds of models people have and how many there are. And its relationship to behavior, in this case, contraceptive behavior. All right, so again, just to recap, for measuring cultural schemas, our goal is to use a relational approach to culture to analyze survey questions on atoms in order to segment the population for behavioral analysis. The challenge is to measure cultural schemas in a representative sample with replicable methods. And the relational methods that we're using for this are first latent class analysis, which many of you will be familiar with. Now there are a number of papers in the field of demography that use latent class analysis, right? It's often used for life course trajectory studies, right? So people look at events and they see which patterns of events happen in people's lives. It's also been used for things like looking at characteristics of people and categorizing people by frailty or other things like that. What we're doing, we think, actually uses its strengths in a better way, because not only does this get at the idea that we understand survey responses better in relation to other survey responses, but we particularly think that the patterns of association picked up by latent class analysis are an integral part of understanding schemas, understanding cultural schemas. So that's the first method we're using. The second method we're using is correlational class analysis, which is a very new method. And this helps us look at more intensely at the structure of the relationships between these attitudes, in a sense independent from the content, which I will talk about. Okay, so let's focus on the content-based part with the latent class analysis first. So this is more focused on content, although it's important to notice that it's not just about content. Latent class analysis also considers the pattern of responses across attitude measures, so it's what are the connections between these things. It's still a relational method. Okay, so.
Are you going to describe this latent class analysis, how it works in more detail, or is now the time to?
Why don't, maybe after one more slide you can ask me about that. So, latent class finds latent classes that explain observed associations among the variables. So this is a non-technical explanation, but we'll see if it satisfies. It groups respondents who generally agree with one another on the substance of the questions. So it looks at your responses, the values of your responses on different items, and tries to account for if there's a latent variable that would maximize the explanation of the variance in how people have responded and groups them accordingly. So does that satisfy?
So I guess what I'm just wondering, if you have a bunch of different items,
Yes.
are these is it kind of like logistic regression? Yes or no? You're in these items with no interactions between them, and then it predicts whether you're in a class or not. I mean, obviously it's more than one class. Or is it testing all of the different possible interactions and somehow sorting through those n factorial combinations and saying which ones tie with which one?
In terms of the process, I can't see it's either of those, but it's closer to the latter. So it is not, yes, it is looking at the patterns in the responses, not just responses as individual separate items. Does that help?
Yep.
Yes.
Could you just give us a couple examples of items so we can?
Oh yeah, totally. Sorry, that's like coming up later. But yes, we have a sample item from each domain, but I will give you an example about birth control. Birth control is too much of a hassle to use, agree or disagree? Does that help? Okay, good. There'll be more extensive ones. Yes?
Yeah, following up on that, so the investigator selects a priority, what attitudes or items go into this?
Yes.
And then is there a way to check the sensitivity if you remove items? Is that what?
Oh yeah, you
does?
can check the sensitivity and analyses. We've done some of that.
Yeah,
Yeah, we have, this is actually a really great data source. We normally do not have this richness of items, but this study was designed not with us in mind, but with, you know, a really strong, so I'll go through and you'll see how extensive the items are. Most surveys do not offer this, but this makes this sort of an ideal way to look at this question. Yes,
Let me just follow up Allison's question, I think, which
Yeah.
is, from the theoretical literature, do we expect that these schemas are going to be ones that are close to the behavior? In other words, that we should be
Right.
asking about motherhood and contraception
Right.
if we're interested in fertility, or should we be asking about authoritarianism and liberalism if we're
Yes.
interested in fertility?
Right. It depends on what, are you trying to statistically predict or are you trying to understand causal processes, right? And so our argument, part of our argument is that one thing that helps us do is understand causal processes. We believe that our theoretical model is that these are the things that are more closely related to causal processes than things like authoritarianism, which, you know, probably would correlate with some of the things in here.
Yeah.
Yes, but we don't think that that's the mechanism that's affecting contraceptive use, that it's authoritarianism.
Okay.
Yes. So that also, one thing we're trying to do is argue that this gives us interpretable, plausible groups of people, and you'll see, some of them have been already represented in the qualitative literature,
Yeah.
that help us understand what's going on rather than just statistically predict.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, good. All right, let's talk next about correlational class analysis. I feel like LCA is in some sense intuitive, right? We're saying we're grouping people who agree about the substance of the questions. CCA is a little bit different. So, CCA compares responses to a set of attitude measures to assess whether respondents follow a similar pattern, regardless of whether their responses themselves are similar, which again is counterintuitive, so let me explain a little bit. It groups respondents who generally agree with one another on the pattern or logic of responses, but not necessarily the content. So, it aggregates people who may not agree on the substance of the issues, but who agree on how beliefs are associated with one another. So these are people, you can think of these as people who use similar principles to organize meaning in a particular domain. So I'm going to give an example. So this is one way of thinking about this in the context of attitudes research. So this is a toy example. We have 3 survey items. One asks about young childbearing, and these are across the x-axis. One survey item asks about college completion. One survey asks about condom use, right? These are our domains. And on the left, we can imagine Likert scale style responses. You can be positive about these things or negative about them. So we have each respondent can be represented by a vector of responses. We're representing those by these lines in this graph. So if we have in blue respondent W. Respondent W is very positive about college completion and condom use, somewhat less positive about young childbearing, right? In normal methods of analysis and standard methods, this respondent would look pretty different than respondent X in red, because they have a different value for every single question. But you can see that the pattern of responses in blue and in red are the same, right? That's the same pattern. It's just been shifted up on the y-axis. So that's one form, but those 2 respondents will look the same in CCA. Another form of variation that's even more counterintuitive is our green dotted line, respondent Y. Respondent Y, unlike W and X, it has lower values for college completion and condom use, and has a more positive attitude about young childbearing, right? The thing that's counterintuitive is that this looks very different from those of the respondents, but you can also see in this graph that they've just been flipped, right? They've just been flipped and switched. And shifted, sorry. So the pattern is still the same, right? They still have evaluate college completion and condom use as being the same, but they're different from young childbearing. And there's a third type of change, which is that the whole vector could be stretched, right? You could have someone who's very enthusiastic who gives either loves or hates everything, right, versus someone who's more in the middle. Now the person who would look different in the CCA analysis is this purple dotted line, Z, who gives the same values for all 3 of these kinds of survey questions. they are showing a different model of patterns of associations. And I'm going to give one more toy example of this, just to fix ideas. So what CCA does is calculates the correlation between the vector of responses for each respondent. This creates a matrix of correlational values that's then partitioned into subgroups of similar respondents using a modularity maximization algorithm. So there are a number of algorithms out there that try to identify communities and data. This is one way by trying to maximize the similarity within groups and maximize the similarity within groups and maximize the difference across groups. Danny.
This is a matrix of individuals by individuals?
This is a matrix of pairs of individuals.
Yeah, but
Because it's a correlational matrix.
yeah, but the correlation between any
Each individual gets a vector of
Yeah.
responses, and it's the correlation between the vectors for each pair of individuals.
So on individual
Does that
vectors
help?
by individual vectors, with the correlation between the vectors in the cells.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks. No.
Here's one more toy example. Each cell entry is looking at the correlation. Right. So you're looking at the correlation between the vector of respondents for each pair of respondents. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, here's one more toy example, and this sort of hopefully makes intuitive sense about where this might be a useful distinction. If we imagine the world of political views for a minute, we're stepping away from fertility for a second. We have economic issues. Imagine a simplified political world where there are economic issues and there are social issues. This is the way we talk about the political world sometimes. You have traditional Democrats who are liberal on both economic issues and social issues. We can think of that as having positive valence. Arbitrarily, we can assign it positive or negative. We can think of traditional Republicans as being conservative on both economic issues and social issues, right? But what you see here is that for both of these groups, although they disagree about the substance of the issues, there's a positive correlation between economic issues and social issues. And that makes them similar in some way, right? They both have a positive correlation between these two kinds of issues. Whereas the libertarians, right? The libertarians who would be conservative on economic issues and liberal on social issues, they have a negative correlation between economic issues and social issues. So they are following a different logic. For them, what you think about social issues doesn't have to be the same as what you think about economic issues. So CCA would group the traditional Democrats and the traditional Republicans together as having positive correlations, and then would make a distinction between that group and the libertarians who have a negative correlation. So that's the intuition. Now, we can think about when it makes sense to do this and what this means, right? And this is something that we're working through. Again, in the domain of political ideology, there's some clear applications. This is something that sociologists of culture have been working on a lot, but as far as we know, there are no studies with a behavioral outcome. And so the theory about what kinds of behavioral outcomes are predicted is developing, and that's one thing that we're working on. Okay, so are we good with intuition? John.
This empty cell, if it were filled, how would we know whether that was a third group,
Right.
or whether it was just the same group as the libertarians but flipped? I mean,
Well, if it were in that cell, it would be the same as the libertarians, but flipped. According to CCA. Right? Because they'd have a negative correlation between those two.
There could be a third dimension that
Sure.
would then allow you to distinguish multiple groups.
Right, yeah. Now, it's possible that those people, also the other thing is it's possible those people don't exist empirically. There's no guarantee that every cell's going to be filled. I don't know what we call them if we have those people. Thank you. But the logic is that, you know, if they also have a negative correlation between these two issues, they would also be grouped together with libertarians, just the way that we're grouping traditional Democrats with traditional Republicans. Okay? All right.
Maybe to put it another way, how do we know there are not four groups there? And I mean, you could do it as four, you could do it as two.
Well, the point is CCA does this as 2, not 3.
Because of the pattern.
Right.
No, but we could, let's say we had all of these, all four cells were filled.
Yeah.
We could say, oh, those are all one group because there are other dimensions. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how do you, you
How do you
don't
know
say
how
in
many
advance,
groups
you
there
don't
are?
say in advance how many groups there are.
Oh, so I made a 2x2 table, but that's not the way reality is.
Right,
Right?
but is how is the algorithm choosing between splitting and having a lot of homogeneous groups versus?
Got it. So the algorithm actually, part of the algorithm is the subpartitioning algorithm decides how many groups there are. It's not like LCA where you have to go through and make a decision yourself. about how it does that. The technical details of how it does that we can talk about later. Yes, but the algorithm here tells you in a deterministic way, there are this many groups in your data. Right. Okay, so the data we're using to study this issue, we find particularly well suited to this topic. It's a relationship dynamics and social life study by Jennifer Barber at Michigan. And it's a population-based sample of 18 to 20-year-old women in a single county in Michigan. I understand some of you have seen stuff about this data before. I'm going to go through it briefly. There's an in-person baseline interview followed by weekly journals charting contraceptive use, sex, and pregnancy over 2.5 years. After 6 months, about 84% of participants have 6 months of data. There are extensive attitude measures at baseline, which is what we find so attractive about this, and because it's a face-to-face interview, missing data is very rare, which is also really important for this method. So we have 982 respondents at baseline, which is what we use for the LCA and RCA analyses. And then we use a smaller subgroup because the behavioral analyses of contraceptive use cover later journal reports. So there's a somewhat smaller group of 822 respondents for that we use in the regression analyses of contraceptive use. Okay, so contraceptive-related attitudes, I'm going to give you the domains and a sample item from each one. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, but birth control, 11 questions. Example, a woman asks her partner to use a condom, hoping she doesn't trust it. Education and career, 5 questions. Sample item, a job's just a way of making a living. Motherhood, 7 questions. Being a mother and raising children is the most fulfilling experience a woman could have. Relationships and sex, 8 questions. Young people should not have sex before marriage. There are also ones that people might be more likely to agree with. There's a wide variety. Timing of childbearing in general, 6 questions. Babies born to older mothers have more health problems. Timing of childbearing for self, 8 questions. It wouldn't be all that bad if you got pregnant at this time in your life. So these are the kinds of items we're using. And this is what goes into the LCA analysis. So now I'm going to show you the results of the LCA analysis. Yes?
They don't go into the LCA. It doesn't matter what cluster they're in.
The domain, we gave them the domains.
Yeah, you name, but these domains, they just go into the
They go in as individual items.
Yeah, 60
exactly.
items or
yes.
okay.
Yes, 45.
Okay.
There's a lot. Yes. Okay. So when we do this, we are going to summarize the results in terms of these domains, though, because that makes it more tractable to understand the results. The LCA analysis, we determined that a 4-class analysis is the best. We partly use goodness and fit measures for this, but it's also somewhat driven by theory. So again, this is each domain. I'm going to summarize for the 4 groups, we gave each of them a name, and I can summarize where they stand on these domains relative to the other groups. So the first group we're calling family conservatives. They are negative about birth control, meaning they have negative attitudes about it. They're neutral on education and career. They're not super into it, but they're not against it. They're extremely positive about motherhood. They're very negative about what we might consider non-traditional relationships. So things like, is it okay to cohabit before you get married? Is it okay to have a kid if you're not married? Right? They're very negative about those. They think it's better to have kids younger in general. And in terms of if they were to timing of childbearing for themselves right now, they're pretty negative about it, but they think they could handle it. And in this sample, there are not a ton of women who are super positive about childbearing right now, which is not that surprising. They're 18 to 20 years old. Okay, so that's the family conservatives. The second group we call meaningful motherhood, and we think of this as a Kathy Eden promises I can keep style group. They're very negative about birth control. They have lower career and education aspirations than the other groups, right, which fits with Kathy Eden's story about them, not a lot of other sources of fulfillment outside of childbearing. They're very positive about motherhood. They're positive about relationships and sex, including sex outside of marriage. And that is actually, they look very similar to family conservatives in a lot of ways, but not that way. That's a big difference. They also think, yes?
I'm sorry, I have a question because if they think the timing of childbearing is good, then they're not interested in birth control, right? So is that birth control, these birth control questions, are they in general or are they for you right now?
They are phrased in general terms, but the respondents might interpret it. So there are things like birth control is too much of a hassle to use, birth control is too expensive, if you use a condom, the guy will think you don't trust them. Those are among the, so I don't know if you would consider those general, but they're relatable to their personal life. But in general, most of the women in the sample do not say, yes, I want to get pregnant now. So even if they generally think that it's better to have children early, And even if they think that it would be okay if they had a kid now, that doesn't mean when you ask, do you want to get pregnant now, that they say yes, right? So we are, right, this is a sample. I mean, we could exclude women who say, yes, I would like to get pregnant right now. There's not very many of them. But yeah, that would be something to consider. Okay, so when we say now would be good, again, it's relative. Compared to the other groups, they're more okay with childbearing right now. Okay, so that's our second group, and note that that's a third of the sample. Okay, next we have what we call the planners. They're very positive about birth control. They have the highest of the 4 groups in terms of highest aspirations for education and career. They're neutral on motherhood. They're neutral on whether it's okay to have sex outside of marriage and these other sort of relationship sequence issues. They think older is fine, or older might even be better in general for having kids. And they're generally negative about having kids now, but they think they can handle it. And then our last group is a group we're calling the not-for-me's. I'm not quite sure what to call this group. They're also positive about birth control, so they're more similar to the planners in some ways. Also positive about birth control, have high aspirations, on the highest for career and education. They're very negative about motherhood. So, although they don't say, no, I don't want to have any kids, if you ask them things like, how much do you enjoy spending time with children? Their answers are much more negative than any of the other groups. They're positive about relationships and sex outside of a traditional marriage model. They're neutral about timing of childbearing in general, and they're very negative about what childbearing right now would be like for them personally. This is also about a third of the sample. So these are the 4 LCA groups. We've put these 45 attitude measures into this, and we've come out with 4 interpretable groups. They make sense. Some of them have been identified in the literature and are intuitive. So we find this to actually be a very useful exercise in seeing in this county what kinds of models do people have about childbearing and how many are there, which of these types of people. Yes?
So maybe you're going to do this, but do these things correlate with other measures that we might think, like, so are the family conservative more religious?
Right.
Are the meaningful motherhood groups
Yeah.
more likely to have dropped out of high school? Like, do we see that kind of?
Yeah, so there is a slide at the end that says the significant differences on some salient socio-demographic measures between the pairs of groups, which I can show. In the interest of time, I'd rather do that at the end. Do you want to come back to that? So yes, and the family conservatives are more religious, that's true. But these can't be predicted by socio-demographic measures alone, right? So there are some correlations that we might expect to find, which in a sense is reassuring. But it's giving us additional information that we couldn't get. We couldn't predict these groups just with socio-demographic characteristics. Yes?
You've chosen to not put those in, but
Yes.
in kind of analytically, one could put,
Yes.
statistically, one could put them in. Would
Yes.
it make any analytical sense, or does it kind of violate the whole idea of
Right.
schemas to have the background characteristics as part of this clustering?
Right. Well, I don't think it's not necessarily, that's something that we could do, and actually Anne Swidler suggested that too. So we could do that. Our interest, and we're not making a strong causal story, so it's possible those things are things that might shape these attitudes.
I guess
Right.
I'm liking what you're doing. I'm just trying to get you to expand a little bit on why it's useful to separate these things
Yes.
from something like education.
Right, right. Well, we put some of those in when we do the behavioral predictions into the regression analyses. Why aren't we putting them in the LCA? Right, we are interested in what we get looking at attitudes and mental models as distinct from socio-demographic characteristics. We are also interested in how those are related, but we really think of these as conceptually being different, and since they're not perfectly predicted by those things, we want to see what happens when we work with these.
So I guess what I was thinking was that these other background characteristics are going to be farther away from the behavior
Yes.
than
Yeah.
these. These are going to be more proximate.
Right.
Is that
That is our thinking, is that part of the cultural environment that shapes these is going to be shaped by those socio-demographic characteristics, right? Those are going to shape your exposure to different models, both at the neighborhood level and at the level of things like media, right? And so that is, in a sense, we do want to separate them for that reason. Does that answer your question? Great, okay. So this is what we've found. We have a description of the sample in this sense. And now we're going to look at its behavioral predictions, and I'm using prediction in the statistical sense now. We're not making a strong causal claim about this. So our DB is contraceptive use. We're using a categorical description of the first 3 months of the study, and this was used by Kusunoki et al. In another study using this data. They found that about a third of the sample is abstinent, and we're using abstinent as a category of contraception because it is a behavior that has important implications for whether you conceive a child or not, right? In a sense, you can think of it as the best form of contraception. And so we're including as one of these categories. We have always consistent use, which is in every week that someone reports having sex, they report using contraception every time they had sex. That's always consistent. The sometimes consistent, in some of the weeks in which they report sex, they had at least one time when they didn't use contraception, but in some of the weeks they used contraception every time they had sex. And the last group is regular non-use, and this is people, remember that we're using the time unit of analysis as a journal, which is a weekly measure, right? So the regular non-use is in every week in which they report sex, they had at least one occasion of sex in which they did not use contraception. So if we're going to be normative about it, this would be the worst contraceptors. I hesitate to use that term, but if you want a simple mental thing, these are the people who contracept least regularly, and then are most regularly are always consistent, or depending on how you think about it, the abstinent. Okay, so this is our outcome, dependent variable, and these are our predictions. We expect that the family conservatives will have more abstinence than other groups, because not only are they not fans of sex outside of marriage, they're really not fans of birth control. So we predict more abstinence. Meaningful motherhood, we predict less contraceptive use based on that whole table of characteristics that you saw. And for both the planners and the not-for-me's, we expect more contraceptive use relative to the other groups. So, what do we find? In our model, we use multinomial logistic regression, DV's contraceptive use, again. For the independent variable, we're using the LCA class assignment, so each LCA group gets a dummy. Those go into the model. And we have a whole suite of controls, which you can see, which include a lot of sociodemographic characteristics. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read them all out loud. We can talk about them more if you want. If anything, we're over-controlling here, right? Because again, these are a lot of things that would be shaping these attitudes, but we wanted a conservative test of whether we get added value from looking at these attitudes beyond what we would get from these arguably easier to measure sociodemographic measures that we're used to. So when we put all this in, here's what we get. And again, we have two reference groups. So our reference group for the independent variable is the meaningful motherhood group. So all these comparisons are how do these groups compare to meaningful motherhood, who we expected to contracept the least, right? And then our reference group for the DV is the ones who are always consistent. And these are relative risk ratios. So what do we find? We find that indeed the family conservatives are much more likely to be abstinent. That's significant. In terms of regular non-use, right, which remember are the people who are doing the normatively worst job contracepting, we find that the not-for-me's and the planners are significantly less likely to be in this group of, quote, bad contraceptors than the meaningful motherhood group, right? And then lastly, we find that the not-for-me's are less likely to be in the sometimes consistent group than the meaningful motherhood group. So now I'm going to give a summary table. This is with one set of reference groups. If you go through all the reference groups, I'm going to give a summary table of the total overview of what the significant differences are and how that matches our predictions. So for the family conservatives, we find that they have a higher relative risk ratio of abstinence compared to all the other groups, all the other LCA groups. And our prediction of more abstinence was supported. For meaningful motherhood, we find that they have a higher relative risk ratio of regular non-use, right, of not contracepting well, compared to all other groups. And they have a lower relative risk ratio of abstinence and being always consistent contraceptors compared to all other groups. So this also fits our prediction of less use. We didn't make a prediction about abstinence, but we find less abstinence for this group of the meaningful motherhood. For the planners, when we compare them to meaningful motherhood, we find a significantly lower relative risk ratio of regular non-use. So they are less likely than meaningful motherhood to be poor contraceptors. We find a higher relative risk ratio of abstinence and a higher relative risk ratio of always consistent use, again compared to meaningful motherhood. The differences with other groups aren't significant. So our prediction of more use is supported relative to meaningful motherhood, and we also find more abstinence among them. And lastly, we have the not-for-me's. We find that compared to family conservatives, they have a lower relative risk ratio of abstinence. We find that compared to meaningful motherhood, they have a higher relative risk ratio of always consistent use. So we had a prediction of more use that's supported in comparison with meaningful motherhood, and then we also have a non-predicted result of less abstinence than the family conservatives. Okay, so we have done the LCA analysis, yes?
How defined are your like guidelines of non-contraceptive use? Do you define it as people that like just don't care at all, or people that just don't use a contraceptive but avoid pregnancy?
Right, so the measure of contraceptive use in this survey is in the weekly journal. They're asked, they're asked if they're in a relationship, and then they're also asked if they had any sexual activity in the last week. And if they did, they're asked for each episode, did they use contraception or not? So it's a self-report of whether you used contraception every time you had sex in that week.
Okay, so non-contraception is just like, it's a little bit like less defined. It's just like you didn't use any like actual contraceptives.
Right, and they have a choice of a bunch of different kinds of contraception. So withdrawal would be in here as using a method of contraception.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Okay, so we've done our LCA groups. We have found these 4 groups. We found that they do have significant predictions of a behavior of interest. So this is the sort of results of what we get when we try to look at patterns of content. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, if you just look at the marginal, like without the model, do you
Yeah.
find what you'd expect?
Say that again.
Like in other words, the family conservatives, if you
Yes.
just look at the fraction of them that contracept without the model,
Oh,
do you find what you'd expect?
you mean just the bivariate relationship,
Yeah.
right? I'm sorry, it's been a long time and a lot of models.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
that's a
right.
really good question, and I will double check that. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I know we did that, just
Yeah,
right
yeah.
now. Sure. But no, that's a good question. I know that without the controls, this all works, but I'll double check on that. Good. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the structure of cultural schemas in CCA, right? That's the new part. So sociologists of culture have argued that structure captures shared logic, right? We talked about that. For example, partitioning populations by different political issue alignment has found that the relative share of ideologues versus alternative political logics has increased over time. That's Baldessari and Goldberg, which is using RCA, which is not quite CCA. Anyway, so sociologists of culture have been talking about, we can look at the structure of shared logics and maybe we can learn something from it. However, when we think about the structure of cultural schemas, there is little theory on how the structure of cultural schemas might shape behavior. So structure has not been explicitly linked to behavioral outcomes in any studies that we're aware of. So we are building theory about what this structure might do, and this is particularly difficult because remember, we're thinking about pure structure, independent. This is a model that would group Republicans and Democrats together, right? So our hypothesis is that we can think about these groups as having cohesive structures or divided structures. So if you have a cohesive structure, then you would see strong correlations across the different items and across the different domains of your cultural schema. Whereas, so you would see things as more connected. If you had a divided structure, then there would be less of a consensus in the group about what these relationships are and less of a shared cultural model. So our hypothesis is that this might produce behavioral differences. Now, when we do the CCA analysis, I'm going to show you network representations of what we find. So we found 4 groups. They do not have names, which reflects our understanding of what they represent. So we have 4 groups that we're calling by number. Each of these graphs, each node in the graph is a survey item. They're colored by different domains, so all the pink items are the birth control items. So a line between 2 nodes represents a correlation. The width of the line represents the strength of the correlation. A dotted line represents a negative correlation. So a solid line is a positive correlation. And a disconnected node then is the absence of a correlation of that item with other items. Okay, so what do we see here? Some of this you can see from the picture, but we also did this using network measures to see what the differences were formally. The least connected group is CCA1, and you can see it has more nodes that are not connected to any other nodes. It's a sparser network. So this would be a divided group in the typology I just described of cohesive versus divided groups. These 2 groups, CCA group 2 and 4 on the right, are somewhat in the middle in terms of network density. Right? So they have more ties, greater density than CCA group 1, but not as much as CCA group 3, which is the densest network. This would be our cohesive group. You could think of these as people who have an ideology, right? People for whom all of these things fit together in a defined way. So again, this represents the shared aspects of the correlations that respondents in this group agree on, that they're either related positively or negatively. Yes.
Do these 4 diagrams make up one culture, or are they 4 different cultures?
These are 4 cultural schemas.
But I mean, do we, in the sense of the word cultural, the way you use
Right.
those words, is
Yes.
each one of these its own culture?
Right.
Or are you saying that
Yeah.
the Michigan population
Right.
is actually the combination of these 4 cultures, and it's really important that the other ones are there?
Right.
Yeah,
That's a
and-
great question. That's a really important question, and that's an empirical question that we partly have to figure out. One of the things that we don't have data on that we would really like to know, both with the LCA groups and with this, is do these shared mental models, they should map onto social groups and people who talk to each other, right? That is what we would like to do, and we try to advance that theory, and the reviewers hate it because we don't have any data on that. Right? And with survey data, we can't do that. So what we would want to do, we could try to proxy for it by looking at sociodemographic characteristics, but that's imperfect, right? I think if you think about David Harding's work on heterogeneity of mental models, he proxies for it partly with neighborhood, right? I don't think this survey would allow for that because of the someone knows where all the respondents live, I don't. But I don't think the density and the sample size would allow us to do that. But that's a direction that would be, that's one of the most important directions to go in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Then?
Well, I think I was asking a simpler version of Josh's question,
Okay.
which is like each survey item shows up in each of these 4 panels, right?
That's correct.
So it's like, yeah.
Yes, so this is one, again, we've partitioned respondents into these 4 groups,
Right.
and each network graph is a description of the group. Now, it's important to note that any individual member of the group, their cognitive schema might not look like this, right? This is the commonality across individuals, and this is another problem in the literature right now, is there's a bit of an ecological fallacy that we're working on. Because especially for the people who aren't connected, we can't say much. We just know that they don't agree with each other, right? We don't know about their content. That's what we get from LCA.
Sorry, those aren't people, right? Those are,
I'm sorry, yes. The people in group 1, we can't say whether their attitudes between this item, much about the relationship between their attitudes between this item and this item, right? We can't tell much about the people in this group from looking at that graph, as much as we can tell about the people in group 3 from looking at their graph. Does that help? Okay, yes.
Yeah, just so I understand, so in group 3, when we see a positive or when something's correlated, it could
Yes.
go in either direction for an individual.
That's right, so a
Yeah.
positive correlation could mean, well, it could mean you're pro on both or con on both.
Okay.
Yes, right. Which is both the beauty and the challenge of CCA. Yes, absolutely. So the question is, we have found these 4 groups, right? We are working on figuring out what does this mean, right? And one way we're figuring out what this means is, does this capture distinct information from the information captured in our LCA groups? Right, so one thing we do is we look descriptively at the overlap between the 2 partitions of the population. And what we see, each column here, each bar is an LCA group, right? We have our not for me's, our meaningful motherhood, all the ones you're familiar with. And then each color is a different CCA group. CCA group 3 is in green, if you're interested. And you see, for example, that the family conservatives are dominated by CCA group 4. However, there's a good number of CCA group 4s in the planners as well. Right? We are capturing distinct information. There's not clear overlap between the different groups. But there are some cases in which there's a strong overlap. So now we know we're capturing distinct information. We are still trying to figure out what we should make of this, right? So we can see that the results are mixed. Okay, so we are going to look at testing the effect of the cultural schema structure on the same behavioral outcome. We use a similar model, now with dummies for CCA membership rather than LCA membership. And what we find is that the members of CCA group 4 have a higher relative risk ratio of abstinence compared to CCA group 3 and CCA group 1. Now you'll remember, this does not follow our prediction that the cohesive group would look different from the other groups. Our cohesive group was CCA group 3. And what we're finding is distinct behavior among CCA group 4, which you may remember structurally looked a lot like CCA group 2. Right, so this is not following our a priori prediction. So our theory development has thus far not been confirmed for this domain.
Is that controlling for LCA? Because CCA group 4, I thought, was the...
Right. So that's a good question. So when we add controls for the when we add controls for the LCA group, those results remain. But also, particularly to look at that, we looked at behavioral predictions for CCA within an individual LCA group. We can't do that for all the groups because the numbers are small in some of them. But if we look just at the Meaningful Motherhood LCA group, then we ask what's the additional value of cultural schema structure within the content group, meaning when we add CCA to the model within the Meaningful Motherhood group, what do we get? We picked Meaningful Motherhood because it's one of the two groups that are big enough for analyses of structures of groups. And we create a model that just looks at the subset of women in Meaningful Motherhood and uses the CCA group dummies. So again, that's the second bar, right? Now, the red group is very small, there's only 7 people in it, so we shouldn't make too much of those results. But we do have enough people in the other groups to look. So this is the multinomial logistic regression predicting contraceptive consistency for Meaningful Motherhood alone. And what we find is that this association between CCA group 4 and abstinence is marginally significant, even when we put in all these controls, again, which are arguably over-controlling. If we take them out, it's significant at the 0.05 level. But it looks like this association that we're seeing is, as you asked, not just due to that overlap. It holds within an LCA group. However, we don't find a lot of other behavioral predictions. It's a small group. We don't want to make too much of this. But what have we gotten out of the structure of cultural schema and behavior? So we asked, how might cultural schema, structure, and behavior be related, right? That was the second part of the project. So we hypothesized that cohesive and divided structures would be what made the difference, and that when you have a cohesive group, there would be more alignment between the parts of a domain. They'd see things as more connected, and that would create a stronger behavioral prediction. So we expected a stronger behavioral relationship from CCA group 3, most cohesive, and weaker from CCA group 1, most divided. That is not what we found. Instead, we found a significant relationship for CCA group 4 for abstinence versus 1 and 3. So our theory building did not result in empirical predictions that supported our theory. There are a couple of possible explanations of this. I know we're running short on time, so you can ask me more about these later. We thought about other ways of analyzing the nature of structure, including across domains. We thought about looking at the content of the CCA groups rather than their structure for a change and seeing if they were different. Again, ask me more about these later if you want to know. And right now, I'll just tell you what are our conclusions about cultural schemas and demography after we have run all these models. So, we found that the pattern content of attitudes in the form of LCA groups is a useful way of identifying population heterogeneity. We found 4 groups that think differently about childbearing in this population. We get interpretable subgroups, right, some of which map onto the literature, that map onto other evidence. Again, this is a largely qualitative literature that we have about differences in how women think about this domain. So, interpretability is nothing to be sneezed at when you have 45 variables. This is a useful, parsimonious way of describing the population. LCA also provides a means for identifying the size of subgroups who organize a domain in a similar way within a population. Again, something demographers are interested in. And cultural schema content in the form of LCA groups yields behavioral predictions about contraceptive consistency. We think that this could be helpful for thinking about causal mechanisms, although we're not making causal claims with this particular analysis. If we're interested in why people use contraception the way that they do, or in what kinds of interventions might affect a population, then we think it's useful to think about 4 types of women with 4 types of ways of thinking about childbearing, as opposed to coefficients of attitudes in a regression. Next. The structure of cultural schemas is a distinct way of identifying subgroups in a population, right? We showed that it's distinct. Alone, however, there's not a clear interpretation right now of what this model is doing. It provides additional analytical leverage when it's combined with content. So when we looked within an LCA group of content, we did find additional predictive power. It has some behavioral predictions, but it is not following our theoretical expectations, so we propose more theory building about how this might affect behavior, which again is a gap in the literature right now. Final conclusions. LCA and CCA allow us to identify subgroups of a population with distinct ways of thinking about childbearing. They are replicable methods that can be used on representative samples of populations of interest. And they give us interpretable groups, and they give us behavioral relationships for latent class analysis. And there are additional behavioral implications for CCA, but the interpretable part is not distributive to CCA. So the LCA part was all very interpretable. The CCA, we see that as a challenge to continue the interpretation. And lastly, I would like to thank the funding for this project and also Jennifer Barber, Yasmin Kusnoki, Liz Ila, and the other RDSL working group members. Thank you.
We have at least 5
Would
minutes.
you like to call on people?
No,
Would you
please
like
go
me to call
ahead.
on
Please,
people?
yeah.
Yes.
I had a question about cohesion. I think I'm getting
Yes.
stopped up on.
Yeah.
So cohesion in your usage is cohesion within the CCA classes, right? Which is across many domains. Would it be right to read cohesion within these groups as sort of an agreement about the domains that are important? So I'm thinking back to earlier questions where there are sort of
Right.
authoritarianism and libertarian, like you could add in these other things that might play. But the cohesion that you're talking about isn't the sort of strength of these correlations, right? It's just a general, you have some groups that they
Right.
say like, motherhood's not so important or doesn't really relate to the attitudes that I have about condom use.
Right.
So,
Well, I think your question kind of contains two different things, and let me see if I'm right about this. So when we think about cohesion, I'm just going to go back to the picture. Cohesion is something that we think about as a property of the CCA group, and it could have higher or lower cohesion. So we're on board there, right? So the first thing you said I thought was about salience, right? So which of these is most important? And we don't know that. They asked everyone these attitude questions, they answered all of them. They don't ask which is most important to you. So it doesn't tell you about salience. However, when there's a line that does tell you something about the strength of the correlation, so that's in there, but that's a separate issue from the salience of a domain.
So to reframe my question, so cohesion then, CCA 1 would be low cohesion because there's a lot of unconnected components.
Yes.
CCA 3, despite the fact, is not cohesive because it's all tied together, though it is. Or sorry, it is cohesive because it's all tied together. It's not cohesive because the correlations between each item are really strong, although that may also be true. Those are separate things. They're not.
Well, because we're using a density measure for cohesion now, that's independent of this tie strength, it's just present or absence of ties. You could also look at cohesion in terms with a measure that used strength of correlation. It looked at tie strength, but we're just using presence or absence. But in these cases, I'm pretty confident you'd get the same thing.
But so like CCA 1 appears to be like a group that cares less about motherhood in relation to, you can say less about their attitudes on motherhood, given their attitudes on.
The second thing you said, yes. Second thing you said, absolutely. Yes.
Something about implications for survey measurement. If I want to insert these constructs in a future survey, do you think there's a way to back out like a new measure of these 4 classes, given what you're finding, instead of asking women 45 items?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we're working on is sensitivity analyses, right? So one thing you could do is you could find the measure within each domain that's most strongly predicted by the other measures, right? And choose that as your sort of focal measure for that domain. And that's something that we can do. Anyone
We
can
should do it for the
data.
field. I think
Actually,
it would be
okay.
really beneficial.
Thank you, okay. That's actually, it's been on the to-do list, maybe we'll move it up. Yeah, that's absolutely something that one could do. I mean, the survey designers actually would probably have thoughts about that. I think what went into designing the survey might have been enough to tell them that. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes.
Yeah, so are the ties, they're not the correlation between 2 survey questions?
They are, for the members of this group,
Okay.
it's the correlation between their responses to those 2 survey items.
Okay.
Right, because the no's are items.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I was getting a little confused by it.
But it's like a threshold, yes, no?
There's a
correlation?
threshold.
Okay.
There's a threshold that's part of the partitioning
Okay.
process.
Okay.
Okay, yes.
And-
Sorry, do you have?
Yeah, and an additional question, I think somebody asked earlier about whether there's socio-demographic differences
Yes.
between these groups.
Oh yeah, do you want to see them?
Yeah.
Okay. There's 2 tables of those, because there's a lot of, I have all these slides at the end, might as well use them. All right, sorry. The way we represent this is you get a symbol, and the symbol shows which group you're significantly different from. right? So clubs is significantly different from meaningful motherhood. The information's a little redundant because every difference is represented by two symbols. But you can see in this first column, the not-for-me's are very different from meaningful motherhood. There's a lot of clubs, right? And these are sort of socio-demographic things, right? Mother's education, whether your childhood family was a single-parent family or not, whether your own mother's first, whether the respondent's mother's had her first child before age 20, sorry. How many children the respondent's mother has, whether the respondent's mother worked for pay. And then we have a second, whether the respondent's parents owned a home when they were growing up, whether respondents on public assistance at baseline, whether the respondent owns a car at baseline, dummies or respondent, well, whether the respondent's black or not, whether the respondent's Hispanic or not, and then religiousness. Yeah. So you can also see here there are a bunch of differences. Well, there's a number of comparisons. Yeah.
Okay, so we're kind of getting to the time where it's questions and not answers. So we can, how many people do we have left? We have 3 or 4, so let's just do questions, no answers.
Go for it.
Go on.
All right, it's kind of related to this, but because at the end of the day, the classification is based on the opinions on some attitudes of how they think about it. But it would be great if you can link this information with objective measures of how they behave itself. For example, I was going to ask you this, what number of kids they have, what kind of structure they have, because at the end of the day, you answer what you want to answer for the matter of the survey, and it's a different thing, the objective reality that each of them have. So I think part of that you can answer with this, but
Yeah, so one of the things that we started to look at, oh sorry, I'm not supposed to.
I think we had a couple of other, Jenna, did you have a comment? Do you want to finish us with a comment?
I'm going to send it to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
One of the things we started to look at was whether having a child at baseline, like having had a child, was related to CCA group, and actually we did find an interesting connection, but it's not CCA group 4. It's not the one where they have a different behavior in contraceptive terms. But that's an interesting direction to go to.
So thank you, Emily, for a great conclusion.